My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 52 years I believed that family was everything. I lived in Cedar Falls, Tennessee, in the same two-story colonial house where my late husband David and I had raised our 3 children. The white picket fence still stood proud around our manicured lawn, the porch swing still creaked in the evening breeze, and the family photos still lined the mantelpiece, frozen moments of what I thought would last forever. But perfect families, I've learned, are often just perfect illusions. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. It started subtly, the way most betrayals do. After David's funeral 3 years ago, my children, Michael, Jennifer, and little Tommy, though he's 25 now, began to change. At first, I attributed it to grief. We were all processing the loss of the man who had been the glue holding our family together for 30 years. David had been the mediator, the one who smoothed over disagreements and kept us all connected with his gentle humor and unwavering love. Michael, my eldest at 30, had always been ambitious. He worked in Nashville as a financial advisor and had married Rebecca, a woman who wore designer clothes and spoke in measured tones that always made me feel like I was being evaluated. After the funeral, their visits became shorter, their conversations more strained. Michael would check his phone constantly, and Rebecca would make subtle comments about the house needing updating and how I should consider my options for the future. Jennifer, 28, and living in Memphis with her boyfriend Derek, had grown distant in a different way. She'd become increasingly critical of everything: my cooking, my clothes, my opinions. Our phone calls, which used to last hours, dwindled to brief, obligatory check-ins. When I'd try to share memories of her father or ask about her life, she'd give me clipped responses and find excuses to hang up quickly. Tommy, my baby, had been living with me since David's death. He'd dropped out of college and seemed to be drifting, working odd jobs and spending most of his time in his room playing video games or out with friends I'd never met. The boy who once told me everything now barely grunted responses to my questions. I told myself he was just struggling with his father's death, that he needed time and patience. The house that had once been filled with laughter, dinner conversations, and spontaneous visits from grandchildren had become a museum of memories. I found myself talking to David's photograph on the nightstand, asking him what I should do, how I could bring our family back together. The silence that answered me was deafening. I threw myself into keeping everything perfect, thinking that if I just maintained the house exactly as it had been, if I cooked all their favorite meals when they visited, if I was always available and supportive, things would return to normal. I polished the hardwood floors until they gleamed, tended to David's rose garden with religious dedication, and kept their childhood rooms exactly as they'd left them, down to the boy band posters on Jennifer's walls and the baseball trophies on Michael's shelves. But perfection, I was learning, couldn't heal what was broken. It couldn't fill the growing chasm between me and the 3 people I loved most in this world. Every forced smile, every unanswered text message, every shortened visit felt like another small death. I began to wonder if I was losing not just my husband, but my entire family. The first real crack appeared during Thanksgiving. I'd spent days preparing David's mother's recipes, setting the table with our wedding china, and decorating the house with fall leaves and pumpkins. I'd invited them all, hoping that tradition and familiarity would work their magic. Michael and Rebecca came for 2 hours, ate quickly while discussing their vacation plans to Cancun, plans that didn't include me. Jennifer arrived late and left early, claiming Derek was waiting in the car. Tommy ate in silence, scrolling through his phone between bites. As I stood in the kitchen later that night, scraping barely touched food into the garbage disposal, I felt something shift inside me. The sound of the disposal grinding away the meal I'd poured my heart into seemed to echo the grinding away of my family. The kitchen, which had always been the heart of our home, felt hollow and cold despite the warmth from the oven. I found myself standing at the kitchen sink, staring out at the backyard where we'd once had barbecues and birthday parties, watching the last of the autumn leaves fall from David's favorite oak tree. The silence pressed against me like a physical weight, For the first time since David's death, I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe they didn't need me anymore. Maybe I was holding on to something that had already died with my husband. That night, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my bedroom now, and sat on David's side of the bed. I could still smell his cologne faintly on the pillow I refused to wash. I held his favorite sweater against my chest and whispered, "David, I don't know how to do this without you. I don't know how to keep our family together. I'm losing them, and I don't understand why." The silence that greeted me was absolute. No comfort, no guidance, no gentle voice telling me everything would be okay. Just the tick of the grandfather clock downstairs and the distant sound of Tommy's music through his closed bedroom door. Music that served as a barrier between us, rather than a bridge. That was the night I first admitted to myself what I'd been trying to deny. My children were pulling away from me, and I didn't know how to stop it. The family I'd built my entire identity around was crumbling, and I felt powerless to save it. The woman who had once been the center of a loving home was becoming an outsider in her own life. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would strip away everything I thought I knew about love, family, and faith, and ultimately lead me to a miracle I never could have imagined. The winter after that disastrous Thanksgiving brought with it a cold that seemed to seep into my bones and stay there. Cedar Falls was beautiful, covered in snow, but our house felt like a mausoleum. Tommy had grown even more distant, and I began to notice things that made my heart race with worry and fear. Money had started disappearing from my purse. Small amounts at first, 20 here, 40 there. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was simply misremembering how much cash I'd had. But when my jewelry box was rifled through and David's gold wedding ring vanished from where I'd kept it on my dresser, I could no longer deny what was happening. Confronting Tommy was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. I found him in the kitchen at midnight, making himself a sandwich, and my hands trembled as I asked him about the missing items. His reaction wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of denial or shame, he exploded with anger that seemed to come from somewhere deep and bitter. "You want to accuse me of stealing?" he shouted, his voice cracking like it had when he was 13. "After everything I've done for you, I'm the only one who stayed, Mom. I'm the only one who didn't abandon you after Dad died, and this is what I get." His words hit me like physical blows. The kitchen, lit only by the small light over the stove, felt like a courtroom where I was both judge and defendant. I could smell the lingering scent of the dinner I'd cooked for just the two of us. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Comfort food that no longer provided comfort. "Tommy, I just need to understand." "Understand what?" "That I might need money sometimes. That maybe living in this house with all of Dad's stuff everywhere is driving me crazy too. You act like you're the only one who lost him." I watched my youngest son. This boy I'd nursed through fevers and nightmares. This child who used to bring me drawings from school and tell me I was the best mom in the world. And I barely recognized him. His eyes held something I'd never seen before. Resentment. Pure, cold resentment. I never said I was the only one. "You don't have to say it, Mom. You just assume it. You walk around this house like you're the star of your own tragedy, and the rest of us are just supporting characters." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I felt my chest tighten, my breathing become shallow. This wasn't grief anymore. This was something else entirely. This was my baby telling me that my love, my presence, my very existence was a burden. Tommy grabbed his sandwich and headed toward the stairs, then turned back to face me. "And for the record, I didn't take Dad's ring. Maybe you should ask Michael about that. He's the one always talking about settling the estate and making sure everything is properly valued." He left me standing in the kitchen, his words echoing in the sudden silence. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, but everything else felt foreign. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the same chairs where we'd eaten thousands of meals as a family, and tried to process what had just happened. The next morning, I called Michael. My hands shook as I dialed, and my voice barely held steady as I asked him about his father's ring. The pause on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had been dropped. "Mom," he finally said, his voice carrying that patient tone he used with difficult clients. "Dad's ring was always meant to be passed down. I'm the eldest son. It should come to me eventually anyway. But Michael, you didn't ask. I shouldn't have to ask for what's rightfully mine. Besides, you're being emotional about this. It's just a piece of jewelry. Dad would want it to stay in the family." The irony of his words, "Dad would want it to stay in the family," wasn't lost on me. What family? The one that was disintegrating before my eyes? I tried to explain that the ring was the last tangible connection I had to David, that I'd been wearing it on a chain around my neck, close to my heart. But Michael's response was swift and cutting. "Mom, you need to start thinking practically. You can't keep every single thing Dad owned like some kind of shrine. It's not healthy." When I hung up the phone, I felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be fixed. I walked through the house, touching David's things. His coffee mug still in the cabinet, his reading glasses on the nightstand, his favorite books with his notes in the margins. Were these really just objects to be settled and valued and distributed? Or were they the threads that still connected me to the man I'd loved for 30 years? Jennifer's reaction when I called her was even worse. She listened to my explanation about the ring, about my conversation with Michael, and about Tommy's increasing anger, then sighed heavily into the phone. "Mom, maybe this is your wake-up call. Maybe it's time to start letting go of some of this stuff. And maybe Tommy's right. Maybe you are making everything about your grief." Her words felt like ice water in my veins. "Jennifer, I'm not making everything about... You kind of are, though. Every conversation we have is about Dad, or about how lonely you are, or about how we don't visit enough. It's exhausting, Mom. We're all trying to move forward with our lives. Move forward, as if David's death was just an obstacle to overcome, not a fundamental change that had altered the landscape of our entire family. As if my grief was an inconvenience they had to navigate around to get to their real lives. I just miss him," I whispered, feeling smaller than I had since childhood. "We all miss him, but life goes on. And honestly, it might be good for you to get out of that house. Maybe downsize somewhere smaller. Make a fresh start." After I hung up, I sat in David's recliner, the brown leather chair where he'd read his evening paper and watched his fishing shows. I could still smell his aftershave in the fabric, could still see the slight wear pattern where his head had rested. The house was perfectly quiet except for the tick of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. That's when I realized the horrible truth. My children weren't just grieving differently than I was. They were grieving differently because they were grieving different losses. I was mourning the death of my partner, my best friend, my anchor in the world. But they were mourning the death of their childhood, the end of the family structure that had defined their lives. And apparently, they saw me not as a fellow mourner, but as a reminder of what they'd lost. I was no longer Sarah Mitchell, beloved wife and mother. I had become Sarah Mitchell, the widow clinging to the past, the mother who demanded too much emotional energy, the woman who needed to be managed and handled rather than loved and cherished. The realization settled over me like a blanket of lead. As snow continued to fall outside the windows of the house where I'd been so happy, I began to understand that my family wasn't just changing, it was ending. And somehow, without meaning to, I had become the problem they needed to solve. Spring came to Cedar Falls that year, but it brought no renewal to my life. If anything, the blooming dogwoods and budding roses in David's garden felt like mockery. Life was insisting on continuing all around me while my world grew smaller and darker each day. The final confrontation came on a Saturday in April. I had spent the morning cleaning the house from top to bottom, as had become my ritual. Every surface gleamed. Every photograph was properly dusted. Every flower in every vase was perfectly arranged. I was preparing for Michael and Rebecca's visit. They'd called the night before saying they needed to discuss some things with me. They arrived at precisely 2 o'clock, Rebecca carrying a manila folder thick with papers. Michael's face wore the expression he probably used when delivering bad news to clients about their investments. They sat across from me at the dining room table, the same table where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, where we'd helped the kids with homework and shared countless family dinners. "Mom," Michael began, his voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk about your future." The word "your" hit me immediately. Not our future as a family. My future. As if I were a problem to be solved independently of them. Rebecca opened the folder and spread several papers across the polished mahogany surface. I could see real estate listings, brochures for senior living communities, and what looked like legal documents. The smell of her expensive perfume mixed with the scent of the lemon oil I'd used to polish the table that morning, creating an almost nauseating combination. "We've been doing some research," Rebecca said, her voice carrying that professional tone she used in her job at the bank. "There are some wonderful retirement communities in the area, places where you could have your own apartment, but also have activities, people your own age to socialize with." I stared at the glossy brochures showing silver-haired people playing cards and doing yoga. Happy Meadows, Senior Living, Sunshine Retirement Village, Golden Years Community. The names felt like euphemisms for places where inconvenient family members were sent to die quietly. "I don't understand," I managed to say, though I was beginning to understand all too clearly. Michael leaned forward, reaching across the table to pat my hand, a gesture that felt more condescending than comforting. "Mom, this house is too big for you. The maintenance, the yard work, the memories, it's all too much. And frankly, we're worried about you being here alone." "I'm not alone. Tommy lives here." The look that passed between Michael and Rebecca made my stomach clench. They knew something I didn't. "About that," Michael said carefully. "Tommy's been talking to us. He's thinking about moving out soon. Maybe getting a place with some friends. Starting fresh." The words hit me like a physical blow. Tommy, my baby, the last thread connecting me to any sense of family, was planning to abandon me too. And he'd discussed it with his siblings, but not with me. I was apparently the last to know about decisions being made regarding my own life. "When?" I whispered. "Soon," Rebecca answered, "which is why we need to move on this quickly. The housing market is good right now. This place would sell fast, and with the proceeds, you could afford a nice apartment at one of these communities. Maybe even have some money left over for travel or hobbies." Travel, hobbies. As if my life was winding down to nothing more than ways to fill time until I died. I looked around the dining room, at the built-in china cabinet displaying my grandmother's dishes, at the family portraits lining the walls, at the crystal chandelier David and I had saved for months to buy when we first moved in. "This is my home," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I know it's hard," Michael said, "but Mom, you have to be practical. What happens if you fall down those stairs? What if you have a medical emergency and no one's here? What if something breaks and you can't fix it?" Every "what if" felt like another reason why I was a burden, another way my existence was problematic for them. I wanted to tell them that I was only 52, that I was perfectly capable of living independently, that this house wasn't just a building, but the repository of 30 years of our family's history. Instead, I found myself defending my right to exist in my own life. "I could get one of those medical alert buttons," I offered weakly. Rebecca and Michael exchanged another look, the kind of look parents give each other when their child is being unreasonable. "Mom," Rebecca said, her voice taking on a firmer edge, "we're trying to help you here. We've put a lot of time and research into this. The least you could do is look at the options. The least I could do," as if considering the dissolution of my entire life was some small favor I owed them for their trouble. That's when Tommy walked through the front door. I heard his key in the lock, heard his footsteps in the hallway, and for a moment felt a surge of relief. Surely Tommy would defend our home, would remind his older siblings that this was where we all belonged. But when he appeared in the dining room doorway and saw the papers spread across the table, his face didn't show surprise. It showed resignation, and something that looked almost like relief. "You told her?" he asked Michael. "We're discussing it," Michael replied. Tommy sat down heavily in the chair at the head of the table, David's chair. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. My youngest son, who should have been my ally, was taking his father's place as the head of a family that was voting me out. "Mom," Tommy said, not meeting my eyes, "I need you to know this isn't about not loving you, but I can't keep living like this. It's like living in a museum. Nothing can be touched. Nothing can be changed. I feel like I'm suffocating." The word suffocating cut through me. My love, my devotion to preserving our family's memory, my desperate attempts to keep us together, all of it was suffocating him. "I thought you needed me," I whispered. "I needed Dad," Tommy said, finally looking at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "I needed our family the way it was. But that's gone, Mom. And staying here, pretending it's not gone, isn't helping any of us." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, I could hear the neighbor's lawnmower, the sound of children playing in the street, the normal sounds of a Saturday afternoon in a neighborhood where families were intact and futures were bright. Inside our dining room, I felt like I was attending my own funeral. Michael cleared his throat. "We've already talked to a realtor. She thinks we could list the house next week, and with the market the way it is, it might sell quickly. That would give you time to tour some of these places, make a decision about what feels right." What felt right? Nothing about this felt right. What felt right was my family staying together, supporting each other through grief, honoring David's memory by continuing the life he'd helped build. But apparently, I was the only one who felt that way. "I need time to think," I said. "Of course," Rebecca said, beginning to gather the papers. "But don't take too long. The market won't stay this good forever." After they left, I sat alone at the dining room table as the afternoon light faded. The house seemed to echo with 30 years of memories, birthday parties and Christmas mornings, homework sessions and heart-to-heart talks, the sound of David's laughter and the patter of little feet on the stairs. That night, I walked through each room like I was saying goodbye. In Michael's room, I touched the baseball trophies he'd been so proud of. In Jennifer's room, I straightened the books she'd loved as a teenager. In Tommy's room, I picked up the clothes he'd left scattered on the floor, folded them carefully, and placed them on his dresser. Then I went to my bedroom, mine and David's bedroom, and sat on his side of the bed. I pulled out the drawer of his nightstand and found the small journal where he used to write down his thoughts. The last entry was dated just 3 days before his heart attack. "Sarah made my favorite dinner tonight, pot roast with all the fixings. Tommy helped her with the dishes while Michael called from Nashville and Jennifer sent pictures from Memphis. I am the luckiest man alive. My family is everything to me. I pray God gives us many more years together like this." I closed the journal and held it against my chest, feeling the weight of dreams that would never come true. David had prayed for many more years together like that. Instead, his death had been the domino that started the collapse of everything he'd loved most. For the first time since his funeral, I allowed myself to be angry with him. How could he have left me to navigate this alone? How could he have died without preparing me for the possibility that our children might not want me in their lives? How could he have been so wrong about our family being everything, when it turned out I was nothing without him? The anger felt almost as painful as the grief, but it was followed quickly by a guilt so overwhelming I could barely breathe. I was angry at a man who'd died of a heart attack, a man who'd loved me and our children completely. The woman I'd become, bitter, angry, abandoned, wasn't someone David would recognize. I wasn't sure I recognized her either. The house went on the market the following Monday. I watched from the living room window as the realtor hammered the "for sale" sign into the front yard next to David's prize-winning rose bushes. The sound of metal hitting earth felt like nails being driven into a coffin. The coffin of the life I'd built and fought so desperately to preserve. Within a week, we had 3 offers, all above asking price. All from families with young children who would fill these rooms with new laughter, new memories, new love. I should have been happy that the house would continue to be a home for someone. Instead, I felt like I was being erased, painted over, forgotten. The buyers wanted to close in 30 days. 30 days to pack up a lifetime, to sort through 30 years of accumulation, to decide what parts of my history were worth carrying into an uncertain future. Michael. Rebecca and Jennifer descended on the house like a well-organized army, bringing boxes and labels and the kind of ruthless efficiency that comes from emotional detachment. I wandered through my own home feeling like a ghost watching strangers dismantle my existence. They sorted through our belongings with casual commentary. "This china set is too old-fashioned." "Mom, you can't take all these photo albums to a retirement apartment. This furniture is too big for your new place." My new place. I'd finally chosen one of the senior communities, not because I liked it, but because choosing felt like the last bit of control I had left. Sunset Manor was clean and safe, with scheduled activities and emergency call buttons, and a dining hall where I could take my meals if I didn't feel like cooking for one. The apartment was the efficiency with a small kitchenette, a living area barely large enough for a love seat and television, and a bedroom that could fit a single bed and one dresser. It was the opposite of everything David and I had dreamed of for our golden years. We'd talked about traveling, about spoiling grandchildren, about growing old together in the house we'd filled with love. Instead, I was moving into a place where people went to wait for death. Tommy moved out on a Thursday. His friends came with a pickup truck and loaded his belongings in less than 2 hours. 25 years of his life fit into the bed of a Ford F-150. I stood on the front porch, watching them drive away. Tommy in the passenger seat, not looking back at the house or at me. He'd given me his new address, an apartment across town that he'd be sharing with 2 friends, and promised he'd call and visit regularly. But his promises felt hollow, offered more out of guilt than genuine intention. I knew, even if he didn't yet, that this was the beginning of a permanent goodbye. That night, alone in the house for the first time since David's death, I experienced a silence so complete it felt solid, like a presence in the room with me. Every creak of the settling wood, every tick of the grandfather clock, every hum of the refrigerator seemed amplified. I walked from room to room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, and realized that this was what the rest of my life would sound like. Echo and silence. I tried calling Jennifer to tell her how hard Tommy's leaving had been, how empty the house felt without him. She listened patiently for about 3 minutes before interrupting. "Mom, you knew this was coming. And honestly, it's probably good for both of you. You were becoming too dependent on each other. Too dependent. As if love between a mother and son was a character flaw to be overcome. I just feel so alone," I said, immediately regretting the words. I could practically hear Jennifer's internal sigh through the phone. "You won't be alone at Sunset Manor. There will be people around all the time. You might even make some friends." Friends. At 52, I was supposed to start over, make new friends, build a new life from nothing. The prospect felt as impossible as learning to fly. The moving day came with unseasonable cold for May. I stood in the empty house surrounded by the few boxes I was allowed to take with me. Clothes, some books, a handful of photographs, David's journal, and my grandmother's silver tea set. Everything else had been sold, donated, or divided among my children like spoils of war. Michael hired professional movers to transport my belongings to Sunset Manor. I watched them load my entire life into the back of their truck in less than an hour. Then I walked through the empty house one final time, my footsteps echoing in rooms that had once been filled with everything I loved. In the master bedroom, I stood where our bed had been and remembered the night David and I had first made love in this house, how we'd fallen asleep talking about our dreams for the future. In the kitchen, I could almost see myself teaching Jennifer how to make cookies, and Tommy standing on a step stool to help reach ingredients in the cabinets. In the living room, I remembered Christmas mornings, birthday parties, family movie nights when we'd all pile together on the couch. All of it was gone. Not just gone, but dismissed as unimportant by the very people who had lived those moments with me. I locked the front door for the last time and handed the keys to Michael. The new owners would take possession that afternoon. By dinner time, there would be different cars in the driveway, different voices in the rooms, different dreams echoing off the walls. Sunset Manor was exactly what I'd expected. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with cafeteria food. My apartment was on the second floor, overlooking the parking lot. The management had tried to make it welcoming with cheerful artwork and coordinating curtains, but it felt like a hospital room decorated by someone who'd never been sick. I spent my first night there sitting on the love seat I'd managed to keep, the only piece of furniture from my real life that fit in this new space. The silence was different here. Instead of the familiar sounds of my neighborhood, I heard wheelchairs rolling down hallways, televisions playing through thin walls, and the occasional call of "nurse" from somewhere down the corridor. I was surrounded by people, other residents, staff members, visitors, but I had never felt more alone. At least in my empty house, I'd been alone with my memories. Here, I was alone with strangers who didn't know my name, my story, or why a woman my age was living in a place designed for people 20 years older. That first week, I tried to participate in the scheduled activities. I went to bingo on Monday and won nothing. Attended the book club on Wednesday, where everyone discussed a romance novel I hadn't read, and joined the craft session on Friday, where I made a ceramic ashtray despite not smoking. The other residents were kind but distant, absorbed in their own struggles with age, illness, and abandonment. I was the youngest person at Sunset Manor by at least 15 years, which somehow made my presence there even more pathetic. The other residents had children who visited, grandchildren who sent cards, lives that had naturally evolved to this point. I was there because my family had decided I was too much trouble to keep around. By the second week, I'd stopped pretending to adjust. I canceled the newspaper delivery. What was the point of staying informed about a world I was no longer part of? I declined invitations to activities and meals, preferring to eat canned soup alone in my kitchenette. I stopped answering my phone when Michael or Jennifer called. Their obligatory check-ins felt more like surveillance than care. The walls of my small apartment began to close in. David's photographs stared at me from every surface, but instead of comfort, they brought pain. His journal lay on my nightstand, but I couldn't bear to read his words about the family that no longer existed. The silver tea set sat unused in the kitchenette cabinet. Who was I going to serve tea to? 3 weeks into my new life at Sunset Manor, I hit bottom. I woke up on a rainy Tuesday morning and couldn't find a single reason to get out of bed. Not one reason to shower, to get dressed, to pretend that this existence was living rather than just surviving. I lay in bed until afternoon, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rain against my single window. The sound reminded me of rainy days in my real house, when David and I would stay in bed late on Saturday mornings, talking about everything and nothing, planning weekend projects or just enjoying each other's company. Now, rain just meant another day of being trapped in a space too small for hope. That afternoon, I made a decision that scared me even as I made it. I would stop trying. I would stop pretending that this life was worth living. Stop forcing myself to find meaning in meaninglessness. Stop believing that things would get better. I would simply exist until existence ended, and maybe that wouldn't be very long. I turned off my phone. I closed the curtains. I lay back down on my narrow bed and closed my eyes, hoping that when I opened them again, this nightmare would be over one way or another. I had no idea that my surrender was about to become the very thing that would save me. I don't know how long I lay in that bed, drifting between sleep and something that wasn't quite consciousness. Time had become irrelevant in my small apartment at Sunset Manor. Day blended into night, and night into day. The only markers were the sounds from the hallway, meal carts rolling past, medication calls, the gentle voices of nurses checking on residents. But I had stopped responding to any of it. When staff knocked on my door, I pretended to be asleep. When the phone rang, I let it go to voicemail. When my stomach growled with hunger, I ignored it. I had entered a space beyond caring, beyond hope, beyond the reach of human connection. It was on a Thursday evening, though I only knew this later, that everything changed. The rain had stopped, but heavy clouds still blocked out the sun, casting my apartment in a gray twilight that matched my soul. I was lying on my side, facing the wall, when I became aware of a presence in the room. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The isolation and depression had been playing tricks on my mind for weeks. I'd been hearing David's voice, seeing shadows that looked like my children, experiencing moments where reality felt negotiable. So when I sensed someone else in the apartment, I assumed it was another hallucination. But then the air in the room changed. The heavy, stagnant atmosphere that had pressed down on me for weeks suddenly felt lighter, warmer, as if someone had opened a window to let in fresh air. Though I knew all my windows were closed, I rolled over slowly, expecting to see nothing but my empty apartment. Instead, I found myself looking at a man sitting in the chair by the window, the chair I hadn't used since moving in because it faced the parking lot, and I couldn't bear to look outside at a world I was no longer part of. But this wasn't just any man. Even through my fog of despair, I knew immediately who he was. There was something about his presence that was both completely impossible and absolutely certain. His face was kind but marked by deep understanding. Not the surface kindness of people who had never suffered, but the profound compassion of someone who had experienced every type of human pain. He wasn't glowing or ethereal, or any of the ways I'd imagined divine beings might appear. He looked completely real, completely human, wearing simple clothes that somehow seemed timeless. But his eyes held depths that I couldn't fathom, as if they contained all the love and sorrow and hope in the universe. My first instinct was fear, but not of him. I was afraid of myself, of my unworthiness, of the mess I'd become. Here I was, lying in a bed I hadn't made in days, in clothes I'd worn for God knows how long, having given up on life itself. What must I look like to someone so pure? But before I could spiral into shame, he smiled. It was the gentlest smile I'd ever seen, full of understanding rather than judgment. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from inside my head and outside it at the same time, as if he was speaking directly to my heart. "Sarah," he said, and my name had never sounded so beautiful. "I've been waiting for you to stop running long enough for me to catch up." I couldn't speak. My throat felt closed, my chest tight. All I could do was stare at this impossible, wonderful presence in my dreary apartment. "You think you've been abandoned," he continued, his voice like warm honey over the raw wounds of my heart. "But I never left you, not for a single moment." The tears came then, not the bitter tears of self-pity I'd been crying for months, but something deeper, tears of recognition, maybe, or relief at finally being seen by someone who understood. "But they all left," I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse from disuse. "My own children, David, everyone, Jesus," for I knew now with absolute certainty that's who he was. Leaned forward slightly in the chair. "David didn't choose to leave you, Sarah, and your children." He paused, his expression growing sadder. "Your children are lost in their own pain, running from their own fears. They're not cruel, just frightened and confused." "But I wasn't enough to keep them," I said, the words torn from some deep place of truth I'd been afraid to examine. "It was never your job to keep them," he replied gently. "Love doesn't work that way. You can't earn it, and you can't prevent its loss by being perfect. You can only give it freely and trust it to find its way back." I wanted to argue with him, to explain how hard I'd tried, how perfectly I'd kept the house, how available I'd always been. But looking into his eyes, I saw that he already knew all of that. He'd been there for every sleepless night, every unanswered phone call, every moment of desperate longing for my family to need me again. "Why did you let it happen?" I asked. The question I'd been afraid to voice even to myself. "Why did you let David die? Why did you let our family fall apart?" His expression grew infinitely tender. Because I love you too much to force love from others. Because I wanted you to discover that your worth doesn't depend on their choices. Because sometimes the only way to find real love is to lose the counterfeit version. Counterfeit. The love that comes with conditions. The love that must be earned and maintained and performed for. The love that disappears when you stop being useful or convenient or perfect. He paused. "That's not real love, Sarah. Real love just is. It exists without reason. continues without reward, remains without requirement. As he spoke, I felt something I hadn't experienced since David's death. Peace. Not the temporary absence of pain, but actual peace. A deep, settled knowledge that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That this moment was sacred. That I was loved beyond measure by someone who would never leave. I don't know how to live without them, I admitted. And you don't have to live without me, he said. And you don't have to live without them forever. But you do have to learn to live with me first. To understand what it means to be loved completely, just as you are. I looked around my small apartment, at the boxes I still hadn't unpacked, at the photographs of people who no longer wanted me in their lives, at the narrow bed where I'd been waiting to die. This isn't much of a life. It's not about where you are, he said. It's about who you are. And who you are is my beloved daughter, chosen and cherished and held close to my heart. The words washed over me like warm water, dissolving months of built-up pain and fear. For the first time since David's death, I felt like I could breathe completely, like there was enough air in the world for me to fill my lungs. What am I supposed to do now? I asked. Jesus stood up from the chair, and as he did, the room seemed to become brighter, though I couldn't see any new light source. Live, he said simply. Trust, hope. And when you're ready, love again. Not because you need it returned, but because that's who I created you to be. He moved toward me, and I thought he might touch my forehead or take my hand. Instead, he did something far more profound. He looked at me with such complete acceptance, such total love, that I felt every broken piece of my heart click back into place. I will never leave you or forsake you, he said, and I knew he was quoting scripture. But it sounded like a personal promise meant just for me. When you can't see me, I'm still there. When you can't feel me, I'm still holding you. When you can't hear me, I'm still speaking love over your life. Then he was gone. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but like dawn gradually giving way to day. So naturally that the absence felt like presence in a different form. I sat up in bed for the first time in days and looked around my apartment. It was still small, still beige, still filled with the remnants of a broken life, but somehow it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a cocoon, a place where something old could die and something new could be born. That night, I got up and took my first shower in a week. I unpacked the last of my boxes. I made myself a cup of tea using my grandmother's silver tea set and sat by the window, looking out at the parking lot that no longer seemed like a symbol of my isolation, but simply like a place where people parked their cars. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I fell asleep not in despair, but in hope. The change wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. In the days following Jesus' visit, I found myself participating in life again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I started eating regular meals, not from hunger, but from a newfound appreciation for taste and nourishment. I began attending some of the activities at Sunset Manor, not to fill empty time, but because I discovered I actually enjoyed conversation with people who had lived long enough to gain wisdom. Mrs. Chen, who lived 3 doors down, became my first real friend at the facility. She was 83, had survived the Cultural Revolution in China, and had a laugh that could fill a room. She'd been watching me through my dark period, with the patient concern of someone who understood that sometimes people need to hit bottom before they can climb back up. "You look different," she said to me one morning, as we sat together in the dining room sharing breakfast. "Your eyes, they have light again." I didn't tell her about Jesus' visit. I wasn't sure I could explain it without sounding delusional, and I wasn't ready to risk having people think I'd lost my mind along with my family. But Mrs. Chen seemed to sense that something profound had shifted. "Whatever happened," she said, patting my hand with her weathered fingers, "I'm glad you decided to stay." Stay. It was such a simple word, but it carried weight I hadn't appreciated before. I had decided to stay, not just at Sunset Manor, but in life itself. And that decision, I was beginning to understand, was the first step toward everything else. 3 weeks after that transformative night, my phone rang while I was reading in my apartment. The caller ID showed Michael's name, and for the first time since moving to Sunset Manor, I answered, "Mom?" His voice sounded surprised, as if he'd been expecting voicemail. "How are you? I've been trying to reach you." "I'm fine, Michael," I said, and realized I actually meant it. "I'm sorry I haven't been answering. I needed some time to adjust." We talked for 20 minutes. Really talked, not just exchanged information. He told me about work, about Rebecca's promotion at the bank, about their plans to buy a bigger house. I listened without feeling bitter or excluded, without searching for hidden meanings or signs of rejection. His life was his life, and it was good. When he asked about mine, I found myself telling him about Mrs. Chen, about the book club I'd joined, about the small garden plot I'd been assigned behind the building where I was growing tomatoes and herbs. He seemed genuinely surprised and pleased. "You sound better, Mom," he said carefully. "More like yourself." "I'm finding my way," I told him, which was the most honest answer I could give. Jennifer called 2 days later, and Tommy the day after that. Both conversations followed similar patterns, tentative at first, then gradually warming as they realized I wasn't going to guilt them or demand explanations or ask when they were coming to visit. I was simply glad to hear their voices, to know they were well, to share pieces of my new reality without requiring them to fix or validate it. The most significant call came on a Tuesday evening in late June. I was watering my tomatoes in the small garden when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Sarah Mitchell?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes." "Mrs. Mitchell, my name is Carol Henderson. My family bought your house on Maple Street. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the realtor." My first instinct was panic. Had something gone wrong with the sale? Was there a problem with the house that would somehow drag me back into complications I wasn't ready to face? "Is everything all right?" I asked. "Oh yes, everything's wonderful," Carol said quickly. "We love the house. That's actually why I'm calling. We found something I thought you might want." She explained that they'd been doing some renovation in the master bedroom, updating the closet, when they discovered a loose floorboard. Underneath, they'd found a small metal box that had apparently been David's hiding place for important documents and a few pieces of jewelry, including his father's pocket watch. "I know these things must be precious to you," Carol said. "Would you like me to bring them to you?" I was quiet for so long that she asked if I was still there. The truth was, I was wrestling with whether I wanted those items back. For months, every reminder of my old life had been painful, evidence of what I'd lost. But now, after Jesus' visit, after the slow work of healing, I found I was curious rather than afraid. "That would be very kind," I said finally. Carol arrived the next evening with her husband, Jim, and their 2 young daughters. The girls were shy at first, hiding behind their mother's legs, but gradually warmed up when I offered them cookies from the batch I'd made for the building's monthly birthday celebration. As Carol handed me the metal box, she said something that stopped my heart. "We want you to know that we can feel the love in that house. There's a warmth there, a sense of happiness that just lives in the walls. We hope our family can add to it the way yours did." After they left, I sat on my love seat and opened David's hidden box with trembling fingers. Inside were our marriage certificate, birth certificates for the children, the deed to the house, and his father's pocket watch, a railroad timepiece that had been passed down through 3 generations. But at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was something I'd never seen before. A small velvet box containing a pair of diamond earrings. Tucked inside the box was a note in David's handwriting. "For Sarah's 25th wedding anniversary. I know it's early, but I wanted to be prepared. She deserves diamonds for putting up with me and blessing me with such a beautiful family. I am the luckiest man alive." Our 25th anniversary would have been next month. David had died 3 months before it, never getting the chance to give me the gift he'd been planning. I held the earrings up to the light from my window, watching them sparkle, and instead of feeling sadness for what we'd missed, I felt overwhelming gratitude for what we'd had. He had loved me, completely, intentionally, with thoughtful planning and careful preparation. That love hadn't died with him. It lived on in these earrings. in the house where another family was now building their own happiness, in the 3 children we'd raised together, who were finding their own ways in the world. That Sunday, I dressed carefully and wore David's earrings to the non-denominational service that Sunset Manor held in the community room each week. Pastor Williams, a gentle man in his 70s who volunteered his time with the residents, spoke about the parable of the lost sheep. But as I listened, I realized the story could be told from another perspective, not just about the sheep that was lost, but about the sheep that learned to find their way home. After the service, I approached Pastor Williams. "I was wondering," I said, "if you might need help with anything. I used to teach Sunday school when my children were young, and I'd like to be useful again." His face lit up. "Actually, we've been looking for someone to help with our outreach program. We visit homebound seniors in the community, bring them communion, spend time with them. Would that interest you?" It more than interested me. It felt like a calling. Within a week, I was making regular visits to elderly people who were truly alone, bringing them not just communion but conversation, companionship, and the understanding that comes from someone who has walked through the valley of despair and found light on the other side. Mrs. Patterson, 94, and bedridden, became my first regular visit. She had no family left, and her eyes would light up every Tuesday when I knocked on her apartment door. We'd share tea and stories, and I'd read to her from her favorite devotional book. One afternoon, she took my hand and said, "You have healing in your touch, dear. I can feel peace when you're here." I didn't tell her about my encounter with Jesus, but I think she would have understood. Mrs. Patterson had lived long enough to know that miracles often come disguised as ordinary moments, as human connection, as love given freely without expectation of return. 3 months later, Jennifer called with news that changed everything. "Mom," she said, her voice different than I'd heard it in years, softer, more uncertain. "Derek and I broke up, and I was wondering if maybe I could come visit you, just for a weekend. I think I need my mom. I need my mom." 4 words that I'd been waiting to hear for 2 years. But when they finally came, I didn't feel vindicated or proven right. I just felt love, pure, uncomplicated love for my daughter who was hurting and reaching out. "Of course," I said. "I'd love that." When Jennifer arrived that Friday evening, she looked around my small apartment with surprise. It wasn't the shrine to the past she'd expected. The photographs were there, but they shared space with new pictures. Me and Mrs. Chen laughing at bingo. The garden where my tomatoes were thriving. A group photo from the book club. My space was small but alive, filled with evidence of a life being actively lived rather than merely endured. "You seem different," Jennifer said over dinner at the small table in my kitchenette. "I am different," I said. "I had to learn to be happy without you and your brothers. And once I did that, I became someone you might actually want to be around again." She was quiet for a long time, picking at her food. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry, Mom, for pulling away, for making you feel like you weren't enough. You were always enough. We were just scared, I think. Scared that if we let ourselves need you too much, we'd fall apart when you died too." It was the most honest conversation we'd had since David's funeral. That weekend, we walked around Cedar Falls, visited the house on Maple Street. The Hendersons were delighted to meet me and show me the improvements they'd made, and talked about everything. Her relationship troubles, my new life, David's death, and how grief had affected all of us differently. On Sunday morning, before she left, Jennifer said something that made my heart soar. "I want to come back next month, and maybe Michael and Tommy would like to come too. Not because you need us to, but because we want to. Because you're interesting now, Mom. You have your own life, and I'd like to be part of it." 6 months later, at Thanksgiving dinner in the community room at Sunset Manor, Mrs. Chen had helped me cook, and several other residents joined us. I sat at a table with all 3 of my children, Rebecca, and Tommy's new girlfriend Ashley. The conversation was lively, full of laughter and stories and plans for future visits. But the most profound moment came when Michael raised his coffee cup for a toast. To Mom, who taught us that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what really matters. And to Dad, who would be proud of the woman you've become. As glasses clinked around the table, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the community room window. A woman surrounded by love, not because she demanded it or earned it, but because she'd learned to give it freely. I was still living at Sunset Manor, still navigating the reality of being a widow, still missing David every day. But I was no longer broken, no longer abandoned, no longer waiting for my real life to begin. My real life was this moment, this meal, this imperfect, beautiful family that had found its way back to each other, not despite our pain, but because of what we'd learned from it. And in that reflection in the window, just for a moment, I thought I saw another face smiling back at me. Kind eyes, gentle expression, the look of someone who had kept every promise he'd ever made. Jesus had told me he would never leave me or forsake me. He'd been right about that. But more importantly, he'd taught me that being loved completely and unconditionally was not just something I could receive. It was something I could give. The earrings David had bought for our 25th anniversary caught the light from the dining room chandelier, and I touched them gently, feeling the smooth diamonds against my fingertips. Some gifts come exactly when we expect them. Others arrive precisely when we need them most. And the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that we are beloved, chosen, held close to the heart of the divine, sometimes comes wrapped in the strangest packages. Empty houses, broken families, and small apartments where miracles wait quietly in the darkness until we're finally ready to receive them. Dear listeners, we hope Sarah's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.